the Greek hoplite phalanx, advancing in a dense wall of overlapping shields and long spears across open, flat ground. The Roman maniple formation, shifting like a living checkerboard, with independent units adjusting position. The Macedonian phalanx struggling and fragmenting as it advances over rocky, uneven terrain. During the Battle of Cynocephali, Roman swordsmen slipping through sudden gaps in the broken Greek line to strike at close range. The steady flow of Greek statues, scrolls, and architectural ideas into Roman homes and public spaces after the conquest, a side-by-side contrast of the rigid front-facing phalanx, strength versus the flexible multi-directional Roman response. The ancient Mediterranean world once looked to the Greek city-states, and later the Macedonian kingdoms, as the unquestioned masters of warfare and culture. For centuries, their armies had stood as the most feared and effective fighting forces in the known world. The hoplite soldiers of Greece had perfected a style of combat that turned ordinary men into an almost unstoppable human machine when conditions were right. Their influence stretched from the western shores of Asia Minor to the coasts of southern Italy and beyond. Greek philosophers, playwrights, and architects shaped how people thought about beauty, government, and the nature of existence itself. In many ways, the Greek world seemed destined to remain the cultural and military center of everything that mattered. Yet a new power was rising far to the west, along the Tiber River. The Roman Republic had spent generations fighting for survival against neighboring tribes and rival cities on the Italian peninsula. What emerged from those struggles was not a loose collection of proud city-states, but a highly organized republic with a professional approach to war that emphasized discipline, adaptability, and relentless expansion. Rome did not field the largest armies at first, nor did it claim the most ancient traditions. Instead, it built a system that could absorb defeats, replace losses quickly, and keep fighting until victory was secured. This methodical approach would eventually bring it into direct conflict with the Greek world at the height of its power. The heart of Greek military strength lay in the phalanx, a formation built around heavily armed infantry known as hoplites. Each man carried a large round shield called a hoplon that overlapped with the shield of the man beside him. In his right hand, he held a long spear, often more than 2 meters in length, that pointed forward in a bristling wall. The men stood shoulder to shoulder and moved as one, creating a front that was extremely difficult to break when it advanced across level ground. The psychological pressure of that moving wall of bronze and spear points caused many enemies to flee before contact was even made. On open plains, the phalanx had dominated battlefields for generations, delivering crushing victories that secured Greek independence and later Macedonian conquests across the east. Yet the very features that made the phalanx so powerful on flat terrain also created serious limitations. Because every soldier depended on the man next to him for protection, the formation could not easily turn or adjust when the ground became uneven. If one part of the line slowed down or stumbled, gaps could open that the enemy might exploit. The long spears were devastating when pointed forward, but almost useless if an opponent got close enough to fight with shorter swords. The phalanx also required extensive training and physical strength to maintain its tight order during long marches and under the stress of combat. These weaknesses were known but rarely tested by enemies who preferred to meet the Greeks on their own terms. Rome developed a completely different solution to the problem of fighting in formation. Instead of one massive block, the Roman army organized its heavy infantry into smaller units called maniples. These maniples were arranged in a checkerboard pattern across the battlefield, with spaces between them, that allowed troops to move forward or backward without disrupting the entire line. Each maniple could act with a degree of independence, advancing, retreating, or shifting to the side as needed. The soldiers carried a large rectangular shield called the scutum and a short sword known as the gladius, designed for thrusting and cutting at very close range. This system gave Roman commanders far more options during a battle. They could reinforce a weak spot, send reserves through the gaps, or pull back a unit that was in trouble without the whole army collapsing. The contrast between these two approaches became clearest during the wars between Rome and the Macedonian kingdom in the early 2nd century before the Common Era. In the Battle of Cynocephalae in 1907, a Roman army under Titus Quinctius Flamininus faced the forces of King Philip V of Macedon. The Macedonian phalanx initially performed as expected, pushing forward with its long spears and creating a terrifying front. But the ground was not perfectly flat. As the Greek line advanced across hills and scattered rocks, parts of the formation began to lose cohesion. The men on the right pushed ahead, while those on the left lagged behind, opening dangerous spaces between the once solid ranks. Roman soldiers noticed the disorder and moved quickly to take advantage. Instead of trying to push against the remaining spear wall, small groups of legionaries slipped through the gaps that had appeared. Once inside the broken formation, they drew their short swords and began striking at the sides and backs of the Macedonian soldiers who could not easily turn their long spears to defend themselves. What had been a strength on level ground became a fatal liability on rough terrain. The phalanx that had seemed invincible only moments earlier started to fragment into isolated pockets of men who were quickly overwhelmed. A similar pattern played out decades later at the Battle of Pydna in 168 during the final war against the Macedonian kingdom. Once again, the phalanx advanced with impressive force on the initial charge. Yet as the ground grew more irregular, the tight formation began to break apart. Roman maniples did not meet the spears head-on. They waited for openings and then poured through them, using their swords to fight at distances where the long Greek spears became useless burdens rather than weapons. The result was a decisive Roman victory that effectively ended Macedonian independence and brought Greece under Roman control within a generation. The Roman success did not come from simply having better equipment or braver men. It came from a military doctrine that valued flexibility over rigid perfection. Where the Greek system depended on maintaining perfect order across the entire front, the Roman system expected disorder and prepared units to operate even when the neat lines disappeared. Commanders could make decisions at lower levels without waiting for signals from the center. This decentralized approach proved far better suited to the varied landscapes of the Mediterranean world, where perfectly flat battlefields were rare. After the military victories, something unexpected began to happen. Rome had conquered Greece on the battlefield, yet Greek culture began to conquer Rome in return. Roman generals and governors who spent years in Greek cities returned home with new tastes in art, literature, and philosophy. Wealthy Romans filled their villas with Greek statues and hired Greek tutors for their children. The Latin language itself absorbed thousands of Greek words, and Roman architects studied Greek temples when designing their own public buildings. Even the Roman religion incorporated many Greek gods under new names. The poet Horace would later write that captive Greece had taken its fierce conqueror captive, capturing the irony perfectly. This cultural exchange created the foundation of what we now call Greco-Roman civilization. The practical Roman genius for law, engineering, and administration, combined with Greek achievements in philosophy, science, and aesthetics. The result was a shared Mediterranean culture that would influence every later European society. Without the Roman conquest, the Greek legacy might have remained more limited to the Eastern Mediterranean. Without Greek culture, the Roman world would have lacked much of its intellectual depth and artistic richness. One useful way to understand the military difference is to picture two different ways of moving a large group across difficult ground. Imagine a long wooden plank carried by 20 people who must all step at exactly the same moment. On a smooth floor, the plank moves steadily forward. But if the floor suddenly has holes and bumps, some people stumble while others keep going, and the plank tilts or breaks. That is close to what happened to the phalanx on uneven terrain. Now picture 20 people, each carrying a shorter board and walking in smaller groups with space between them. When one group hits an obstacle, it can pause or shift sideways while the others continue. The overall movement continues, even though individual groups adjust. This is closer to how the Roman maniple operated. The Roman system also included a clear progression of equipment and roles within each legion. Younger and less experienced soldiers began with lighter armor and served as skirmishers who could harass the enemy and then retreat behind the heavier troops. The main fighting line consisted of men in their prime, who carried the heavy shield and sword. Behind them stood the veteran soldiers who formed a final reserve. This layered approach meant that Rome could sustain combat longer than many opponents expected. Even if the first line tired or suffered losses, fresh troops were ready to step forward. Greek armies, by contrast, relied heavily on the quality and training of the hoplites themselves. When those men broke formation or lost heart, there were fewer organized reserves to restore the situation. The Macedonian kings did employ more diverse troops, including cavalry and light infantry, yet the phalanx remained the decisive element in their plans. Once it lost its cohesion, the rest of the army often followed into retreat. The Roman Republic also benefited from a political system that supported long wars. Citizens who served in the legions had a direct stake in the success of the state. Victories brought land, glory, and political advancement. Defeats were followed by new levies rather than surrender. This resilience allowed Rome to fight multiple simultaneous campaigns across different fronts, something the Greek city-states and even the Macedonian kingdom rarely achieved. In the end, the story of Rome and Greece is not simply one of conquest and defeat. It is a story of how two very different approaches to organizing people for war and for peace came into contact and ultimately blended. The phalanx represented the peak of classical Greek military thinking, a triumph of collective discipline on the right kind of ground. The maniple system represented a more pragmatic Roman willingness to accept messiness and adapt in the moment. When those two systems met on the hills of Greece, the more flexible approach prevailed. Yet the cultural victory of Greece over Rome ensured that the ideas, stories, and artistic achievements of the Greek world would continue to shape history long after the last Macedonian king surrendered. The Roman Empire that eventually emerged carried Greek learning to every corner of its vast territories. In that sense, the fall of the phalanx marked not the end of Greek influence, but the beginning of its widest spread through a new and remarkably durable political structure. The Mediterranean world that followed was neither purely Greek nor purely Roman, but a powerful combination of both traditions, and that combination would define Western civilization for centuries to come.